Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. I am super excited you're here today because, well, we're looking at something absolutely fascinating. When we picture the gleaming skylines and those massive mega projects across the GCC, the unbelievable architecture in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, we immediately see structural marvels. But behind every single one of those physical structures is an equally massive, highly complex legal structure, the construction contract. Today, we're diving into this hidden world to uncover how the legal foundation of these projects is literally shifting beneath the feet of the people building them. So, consider this for a second. What actually happens when a standard contract is anything but standard? Contractors stepping into these massive GCC projects usually think they're signing familiar, internationally recognized agreements. But as we're going to see today, what looks like a perfectly standard document on the outside is frequently hiding some incredibly aggressive traps that modern construction contractors are forced to navigate every single day. Here's our agenda for today. First, we'll look at the standard contract illusion. Then, we'll break down the mechanisms of employer bias. After that, we'll figure out why this problem actually persists. Then, we'll introduce the Contra Proferentem defense. And finally, we'll look at the push for balance. Okay. Let's dive into this. Section 1. The standard contract illusion. Expectation versus reality. In the international construction industry, standard forms, specifically the ones published by FIDIC, like the famous Red Book and Yellow Book, are designed to promote equitable risk allocation. The baseline expectation is pretty simple. You assign the risk to the party best equipped to actually manage it, and you make sure the contract is administered neutrally. But the reality? Well, across the GCC, these standard forms are rarely ever used as intended. Instead, employers and developers bolt on what are called particular conditions. These bespoke amendments effectively bulldoze the standard rules, and they transfer a wildly disproportionate amount of commercial, legal, and operational risk straight onto the shoulders of the contractors and subcontractors. To really put this into perspective, listen to this stark quote from a legal commentary published by Chambers and Partners. Most amendments are carried out by employers and are usually heavily skewed in their favor. This perfectly validates the exact illusion we're talking about. You might look at the cover page and think, great, a standard FIDIC contract. But once you're inside, practitioners often find they absolutely cannot rely on their familiarity with the standard wording. Those particular conditions have fundamentally mutated the agreement into a highly biased, bespoke contract. Which brings us to Section 2. Mechanisms of employer bias. Let's see exactly how the scales tip. Employers use a few very specific mechanisms to dramatically shift the balance of power. First off, they use strict notice provisions as conditions precedent. What this means is if a contractor misses a rigid, incredibly tight deadline to submit a notice, even if it's just due to a tiny procedural technicality, they automatically lose their right to an extension of time or getting paid. And that's regardless of whether the claim was actually valid. A comparative study in Science Direct specifically flagged these aggressive notice regimes as a massive cause of disputes across GCC projects. On top of that, employers give themselves unrestricted powers to vary the work, they slap on uncapped liquidated damages, demand extensive fitness for purpose obligations, and, get this, entirely transfer the risk of unforeseen ground conditions straight to the contractor. The shift in power here is drastic. Under a standard FIDIC contract, the engineer is supposed to be this independent, completely neutral administrator. But in the GCC reality, their authority is often stripped back until they're effectively just a mouthpiece for the employer. An academic study by Kendi Publishers pinpointed this exact issue. They found that the weakened authority of the engineer, along with terrible variation management, are huge contributors to disputes on GCC megaprojects. Claims that totally deserve to be evaluated on merit get tossed out over technicalities, and risks that really should be managed collaboratively just unilaterally dumped on the contractor. And what makes this whole situation even worse is how these documents are actually put together. A technical commentary by CM Guide noted that repetitive amendment practices and this really lazy cut-and-paste drafting approach end up creating, and I quote, one-sided language biased towards the clients. Basically, lawyers or developers will just blindly copy the harshest amendments from older projects without even thinking about the specific context of the new one. This repetitive copy-paste imbalance is an absolute disaster for contractors, especially right now during periods of high inflation or crazy supply chain disruptions, where they are essentially left holding all the risk without any contractual relief whatsoever. Moving right along to Section 3, Why the Problem Persists, let's examine the systemic cycle. Now, you might be wondering, why on earth would a contractor ever sign something like this? Well, a fascinating dissertation from the British University in Dubai confirmed that there is a deeply systemic imbalance going on here. Let's walk through this vicious cycle step by step. Step 1, you have a massive market oversupply of contractors, all competing aggressively for a limited number of high-value megaprojects. Step 2, all that intense competition completely destroys their negotiation leverage. Contractors basically can't push back because, well, somebody else will just step in and take the job. Step 3, this forces them into just accepting these highly biased contracts to keep the lights on. Step 4 is where the pain trickles down. Subcontractors at the bottom of the food chain end up inheriting even harsher back-to-back terms. And finally, Step 5, inevitable cash flow and project pressures start mounting, forcing contractors to prioritize mere day-to-day survival over actually enforcing their contractual rights. It is a tough spot to be in.
Section 4, the Contra Proferentem defense. Let's look at the legal backstop.
Here is where things get really interesting. Enter Contra Proferentem. This is a powerful legal principle stating that if a contractual provision is ambiguous, meaning it's capable of more than one reasonable interpretation, that ambiguity must be interpreted against the party that drafted or imposed the clause. So in the context of the GCC, since those deep-pocketed developers and employers are the ones drafting these heavily amended bespoke particular conditions, this doctrine actually serves as a vital shield to protect the weaker party. If the employer writes a confusing one-sided clause, the court is going to rule against them. And the reason this works so effectively in the GCC is because of the overarching legal framework itself. Unlike purely common law systems, which might ruthlessly stick to the literal text of a contract no matter how harsh it is, most GCC states operate under civil codes that are heavily influenced by Islamic jurisprudence. A legal analysis by Lexology pointed out that UAE courts, for instance, frequently prioritize overarching equitable principles, things like good faith, fairness, preventing the abuse of rights, and stopping unjust enrichment. So what we have is this intense friction between heavily amended, harsh common law-style contracts and the deeply equitable principles of the local civil code. So when does this actually come into play in court? Well, Hassam Zakaria Legal Consultancy notes that tribunals will lean heavily on Contra Proferentem in a few specific areas where employers typically introduce ambiguity to try and shield themselves. We're talking about those strict notice conditions precedent we mentioned earlier, limitation of liability clauses, messy extension of time entitlements, variation valuation mechanisms, and really broad exclusion clauses. If an employer tries to hide behind confusing, poorly drafted boilerplate texts just to get out of paying the contractor, the court can totally use Contra Proferentem to strike that defense right down. But, and this is absolutely crucial to understand, this doctrine is not some magic wand that contractors can just wave to instantly escape a bad deal. It's really a two-step process, where Contra Proferentem acts as a secondary, last resort tool. Step 1 is always for the courts to look at the ordinary wording, the commercial context, industry practice, and those principles of good faith to try and uncover the contract's true meaning. It is only in Step 2, when there is genuine ambiguity that literally cannot be resolved through that standard context, that Contra Proferentem is finally applied to penalize the party that drafted it. Section 5, a push for balance. Let's look toward the horizon. The really good news here is that the market is finally waking up to the long-term damage of the systemic imbalance. Major lenders, international investors, and big multinational contractors are starting to say enough is enough, and they're pushing back. They're demanding much clearer drafting, and they're pushing for the use of dispute avoidance or adjudication boards, often called DABs, to resolve issues in real time, right on the ground before they explode into massive legal battles. So we're actually seeing this gradual but real shift back toward collaborative contract administration and balanced risk allocation, stepping away from that aggressive unilateral risk dumping that has dominated the region for so long. I want to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on. Can the incredible record-breaking growth of GCC construction truly survive long-term on a foundation of aggressive risk dumping? Or is a return to genuine collaboration and balanced fairness the absolute only way forward for real sustainability? The ongoing legal battles surrounding Contra Proferentem strongly suggest that the courts are already demanding fairness, so maybe it's time the contracts did the exact same thing. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this gave you a brand new perspective on the invisible frameworks that are literally shaping the skylines of tomorrow. Stay curious, and I'll see you next time. Hey everyone.